Okay, let's get started. Good morning, good afternoon to all of you. Thank you so much for so many of you joining us. It's fantastic to see some familiar names and a lot of names I do not recognize. My name is Ping. I am CEO of Optigo Networks. Thank you so much for joining our short webinar today, in which we'll discuss distributed denial service attacks on building automation systems in particular. I have Ryan here with us. He's going to stay muted and off of video. He is in the background to help us with any questions, whether it's audio or questions on the subject or on Optigo Networks. So on that, let's get started. This is a short webinar. It will take no more than 15 minutes to cover the content, leaving us with a time for Q&A. But if you do have questions along the way, please don't hesitate to just send them in the question box here. And again, Ryan will either punt them over to me or we'll wait till later in the session. And in some questions, we may actually follow up with you outside the webinar if the questions are a little bit more elaborate. So on that note, also FYI, this session is being recorded and will be made available on our YouTube channel. I won't go through the agenda here, but just give you a little background on why we put this webinar together. We, particularly because of who we are in the industry, we often hear about my system is slow, and it's slow because the network is the reason why it's slow. So after years and years of working with system integrators and building owners, consultants, architects, anyone involved with building systems, we've done a lot of research, and in 99.9% of the case, the network was not to blame. What I mean by that is, if we were to rip the switches and routers that consist of the IT network, would that solve the problem that the person reported on how the system is slow? And again, in 99.9% of the case, improving the network would not have to solve the problem. In fact, I can tell you that in my tenure in this industry, I've only seen 2 cases where ripping and replacing the network did help. In one case, the system had significantly grown past its capabilities at the network level. And the second case, there was a very, very high level of daisy chaining of low-cost switches that caused a bottleneck in some of the midline switches. Those are the only 2 cases, and I can tell you with confidence that in all the other cases, improving the network did not help. So that lands us in this topic here. We have been helping a lot of customers in the industry identifying why their systems are slow, why their systems are unstable, and it led to the concept of a denial service. So let's just talk a little bit about definition. We'll go into why, on one hand, we'll talk about network that's slow, and on the other hand, we'll talk about a topic that typically shows up in the Wall Street Journal as a cybersecurity issue. So let me just back up a little bit. This is definition from Wikipedia. And again, I am providing another link here to a great page with more resources. The definition is straight from Wikipedia, and I highlighted the important components, but a denial service is when you render a service unusable. Either the service crashes or the service is so slow that it cannot be used. And this is again done primarily by flooding the target system with too many messages, too many requests. And again, these messages and requests can be either network-based, or it can be application-based, or even other levels. One of the best examples is from October 2016. There's a malware out there that came out before October 2016 called Mirai. Mirai turns IoT devices like IP cameras and DVRs and home routers into an attacker. In 2016, October, Mirai was used to overtake thousands of IP cameras that had default password that could not be changed, and therefore they were well known. They turned these thousands of cameras and attacked a DNS, a domain name server provider. And in turn, it made the DNS unusable, which took down services like GitHub, Twitter, Reddit, Netflix, Airbnb down for about 5 hours. So this is a perfect example of a distributed denial service attack. the difference between, the important thing here is if you add the first D in from DDoS, it just means it's distributed, so it came from multiple vectors. I didn't mention it on this slide, but a distributed denial service is much harder to defend against a single attacker. A single attacker, you can find the source of the attack and set a firewall rule, for example. When it's distributed, you may have hundreds, thousands of attackers, and so setting up the IP filters or the UDP port to filter is much harder. Now, again, DDoS is typically associated with cybersecurity attacks. You can look online and everything is around cybersecurity. It's a malicious intent, it's intentional. Today here, what I want to cover is what we call unintentional DDoS, or unintentional denial of service. So it was not malicious. It happened because of weakness in the system or because of a different intent that we wanted to do. So here in our context is, and I'll cover this in a little bit more, our building automation system might be overloaded. We're demanding too much off of it, and we're creating this denial service onto a IoT router or a device in particular, a server, an application, whatever it is, rendering that service unusable. And what I want to just make sure that everyone understands here is that by flooding one or more devices, you're causing its CPU to be at 100%, fully tapped out. Maybe the memory is completely full. Maybe the IOs, the read and write IOs to the solid state drive, for example, is fully flooded. And so the computer, the device can no longer be used. I'm sure all of you have experienced this with your web browser. Maybe you open too many browsers, too many tabs, and now everything is slow. And you probably noticed that by closing some of them, by clearing your memory, by maybe rebooting your computer once in a while, everything is nice and fast again. Exact same idea. Is your computer runs out of memory, your computer runs out of CPU, and it can't keep up with what it needs to do. And so the outcome of a denial of service or oversubscription or oversaturation is that things will be slow, just like I said with the web browser example. Things will be unstable, right? You click here and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Or worse yet, you crash. That famous Windows blue screen of death. But that can happen with anything. Now, if we take this into our industry, this is when you're requesting data, you're trying to draw, the floor plan of a building and superimpose the temperature of all the rooms, and it takes minutes, perhaps, for the data to come back, or maybe some of the data doesn't come back at all. And so that's very often due to one or more device, and sometimes these devices are part of your network that get oversaturated, and so it can't keep up with its primary function. Why is building automation so susceptible to DDoS or to oversubscription? Again, over time, we've identified these 4 reasons. One is that these devices are optimized for cost and for lifespan. What I mean by that is that variable air volume, that VAV that you have in your ceiling, if it costs you $2,000, you will not use it. You could not deploy that. It doesn't make business sense. And so these manufacturers have to optimize for cost. And so the CPU that's used in it, it's not the same as what we have in our computers. It's not even the same as our latest iPhones. It might be a small ARM processor, ARM7. And they may even underclock or clock down the clock on the CPU to reduce the heat dissipation of the device so they can last that 15 years that you expect it to work in your ceiling. The second is a lot of these protocols are very high rate and very high broadcast. We'll talk about broadcast a little bit more in just a second. But BACnet, for example, one of the most popular protocol used in our industry, has a lot of broadcast. It is a broadcast heavy protocol by design, by definition. Without the broadcast, it will be hard for us to discover new devices. It will be hard for us to get the alarm and alerts. Just to go a little bit more in detail with broadcast, when we have a high level of broadcast means that a single sender, a single device sending out one broadcast, it goes to every other device. So if you have a system with 1,000, 2,000, 10,000 devices, and all of them are sending broadcast, you're effectively elevating the noise level. You're causing all these devices to have to process every single one of these packets, whether or not it's relevant to it. So for example, if you're broadcasting the temperature of a room, and that's really only needed for one portion of your system, an air handler, all the other, whatever, 1,000 devices are still getting that packet. It doesn't require that data, but underlying at the OS stack, at the application level, it still has to process that packet, that message, to then realize it doesn't need it. So high broadcast is another main reason why these devices can easily get into an oversaturation. The third is that these manufacturers are designed for functionalities, right? They're giving you fantastic graphics, they're giving you lots and lots of features and functions. They're not designed for network resilience. They don't employ techniques that are used in IT for example, rate limiters or firewalling, things like that, or even back pressure. These are terms that are used in the IT industry. And again, these manufacturers are designing for functionality. Last but definitely not least, and this is definitely a growing reason, is that we are increasing the demand for data in our systems, right? Not long ago, these building automation systems were really only command and control. You set a point, you read the temperature or read the pressure in one place, once in a while on change, and then you update it. And now we want to superimpose these digital twins on top of our system and collect points every 5, 10, 15 seconds. We want to be able to collect it real time. We want to store it so that we can go and do some business analysis on top of it. The underlying system may not be capable of doing that. So by increasing the data demand on the overall system, we're causing these devices to work harder and pushing them closer and closer to their limit. So how do we identify and how do we address these device saturation? And by the way, you'll see that I'm transitioning from the term of DDoS to device saturation because, again, I don't want to scare everyone to say that this is a cybersecurity issue that we're talking about here. It can be a cybersecurity issue, but in most of the cases, thank God for us, the majority of case where these systems are slow is an unintentional DDoS. So I'm going to use the terminology of oversaturation or saturation just to avoid that confusion with a cybersecurity topic. So to identify, the best ways to identify a device saturation, if possible, is to measure and monitor its internal memory use and CPU resource. That might be possible on a server, for example, because you're running Windows or Linux, or and you can run some resource monitoring on it. I realize that may not be possible for a lot of building automation controllers and so on. I know that a lot of vendors are providing different techniques to measure or to deduce the memory and resources. For example, there's perhaps scan time or cycle time. I know there's other devices that will have resource panels. If you're able to measure and monitor that over time, making sure that they don't reach too high of a level, then you should be able to avoid that problem. If that's not possible, which in many cases it's not, the other next two technique is to watch the response time. So when you're reading a point, you want to measure how long it takes for that response to come back. I'll show you a little bit more on that. If you use Wireshark, there are techniques to do that if you know how to use Wireshark. And the other one is to look for drop responses. So as I mentioned earlier, when a device reaches oversaturation, it tends to do one of three things. One is it slows down. So measuring the response time can be an indication that the device is overloaded. The second is it can stop dropping messages, dropping packets, dropping responsibilities, basically. And so by measuring how many requests was sent to that device and how many were actually responded, it can also give you another indication of that. And so your response time should be relatively quick. It should be in the 100 millisecond at the maximum. Tens of milliseconds is really what we should be looking for. These devices are very, very fast. They should be able to respond to any request within 20 to 50 milliseconds. In our world, very often we'll see the half-second range. That's still a little bit high for my liking, but that's reasonable. But when you go beyond that, when you're stacking a lot of reads out of this device, you can kind of see how it adds up. Again, we'll look at some examples moving forward. How do we fix it? So if you are able to measure and identify a device is oversaturated, the first lowest hanging fruit is that broadcast traffic. Because broadcast goes everywhere, as I talked about, look at what devices are creating that broadcast traffic. Can you reduce that? Can you reduce the discovery period? Can you reduce the alarm and alerts that are broadcasted? If you're able to do that, you will reduce that noise level and improve the performance across the board and on the entire system. Are you able to reduce your poll rate? If you're reading data every 5 seconds, but you only really need it every 5 minutes, make that change. You'll reduce the burden on that device. I realize that's not always possible, but when possible and where possible, reduce that poll rate, reduce the demand on these devices, reduce the demand on these small little ARM processors. Last but not least is also understand that these devices are optimized for one service or another. Very often we'll see devices that can do many things. For example, for the world of BACnet, many of you are big BACnet users, we'll have devices that are acting as BACnet routers, they're acting as BBMD, and they're also running some intense program within it. When it has to do all that, it has to transfer packets across from the routing function or the BBMD function, and also run, some elaborate program. It's competing for resource. All those things are competing for resources. So we'll look at some examples here. I will use our product called Visual BACnet here to highlight how do you identify that. I mentioned that one of the measurement is to look at response time. So again, let's say we go and read the temperature from a device and we want to see how long it comes back. Here's an example, a real life example. This one had some really, really high delays. You see, they're almost a minute long. So imagine you're reading a single point or multiple points, and it takes almost 60 seconds to come back. That's not a usable system. You're reading thousands and thousands of these devices. And so that's not reasonable. I want to just get your eyes on something here. I did massage this data. This here, without going into detail, this is an MSTP device going through a device that acts as a BACnet router. You can see is the same BACnet router, and the last row is showing that the device acting as a BACnet router is also itself a device that has to respond to some kind of request. Even the transfer over IP without going through MSTP, without going through any other BACnet devices is taking 3 seconds. Now, 3 seconds is significantly better than 60 seconds, but that's still not reasonable. So this is already an indication that this BACnet router here, this device, is likely overloaded, and that's why it's not able to keep up. Let me give you another evidence. So same system, same time. This is what we call mixing acts. So every request is coming back with acknowledgement or response. We're measuring how many of these requests were actually responded, or in our case, we're measuring how many of those were not responded. So here's the example. The device acting as a BACnet router, even directly, is missing 30% of the requests. And by the way, 330 requests is not unreasonable over one hour. It's not that bad, right? So you're not flooding it with just this request. But then you add all the MSTP devices that it has to route through. And you see this one has really a lot of trouble coming back. It's responding less than 40% of the time, and so on. So if you combine the two things together, you can see that that device acting as a BACnet router is creating delays to itself and as a BACnet router. And it's also dropping requests. Those two things, that's 2 out of 3 of those outcomes typically when a device is oversaturated. Let me just give you an example, an idea here. This is a few days later. They identified that device as a BACnet, that acted as a BACnet router that created a lot of delays, a lot of problems. And so they went and fixed it. And you can see that the response is significantly improved. I won't go into too much detail here, but really what they did is they identified that the application and routing functions were all on one device. That device had a very, very elaborate program. They separated that. They moved the routing function to another device. And it really improved. You can see it's less than half a second poll rate now. And by the way, sorry, in response time. And by the way, in their case, they were able to increase their poll rate, getting them closer to what the customer expected in terms of responsiveness of their system. So again, if you're able to measure and identify, you can fix it. The quick summary, building automation systems are unfortunately very susceptible to DDoS, unintentional DDoS. And that's because, again, they are typically running small devices. The protocol is fairly chatty. We're demand a lot of these systems. And then, again, these systems could be there for 10, 15, 20 years. So we have to be very, very careful with that. Strongly recommend to monitor and measure the system performance one way or another, whether you're using tools available to you by your vendor, or you want to use one of our product, or you can use Wireshark, or you may even just once in a while measure how things are going and be able to identify that bottleneck and deal with it. And very, very important, again, back to that definition of denial of service, if unchecked, your data and your services will be interrupted. You will not be able to get the data that you rely on to run your business, you will, or your customers rely on to run your business. And you may even get into cases that's much more devastating than that, where your chiller plant, your heating plant may not operate correctly because there's a lot of delays, and it creates this lag into the tuning aspect of your system. That's what we have. This is what we've, again, been dealing with a lot in the last few years. Last comment I want to leave with is that in all those cases, except for those two I mentioned, it is not the network that's to be blamed, it's the devices that are connected with too much to process that is causing the problem. In fact, I will say that in most of the cases, if you improve the network, say you rip out your 10100 network switch and you put in 10 gig switch, it would actually make your problem worse. You would create bottlenecks even worse. So I see there's some questions coming in. Thank you, Ryan. Right, how do we know if it's unintentional or malicious DDoS? Very good question, excellent question. The best way to look at that is to look at where the access is coming from. Now, attacks can come from inside, and that would be a big problem. But if the attack is coming from outside, and you recognize that that's not one of your services, you're not running this cloud system on this IP address, it's likely you are getting attacked from outside. Also, if it's been changing over time, it's unlikely to be malicious. Now, it's possible, depending on what kind of organization you run. If you run a university, unfortunately, you may have some students that are just bored and wanting to do it for fun. And again, if you read that Wikipedia page, you'll hear some funny stories there. But again, looking at the vector, where it came from, should give you a pretty good indication. Great question. Thank you for that. Any other questions? Okay. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to us. If you want to learn a little bit more about what we do, feel free to reach out to us. You can send us an email at info@optigo.net, or you can reach us through our webpage. Our website has a chat function. You can use that. Hopefully this was informative. I will leave with one last poll just to see if this was valuable to you. Please let us know so we can tailor the future webinars to fit what you are looking for. Thank you so much. I hope you all are doing well, and take care all. We'll see you here and there. Thank you. Take care.